Welcome to Troubled Waters Ahead, Indiana's 2024 Water Policy Preview. My name is Indra Frank, and I serve as the Environmental Health and Water Policy Director for the Hoosier Environmental Council. I'll be your moderator for today's webinar. We're very glad to have you with us. We appreciate the ongoing support of HEC Green Business supporters, and that'll be next slide. Our supporters like Logistic, Innovatus, Solar, and Singer Wealth Advisory of Raymond James. They are among HEC's green business supporters, and without them, we cannot have events like today's webinar. We're looking forward to your questions, so as you're listening to our three speakers, please enter your questions into the Q&A feature that you see at the bottom of your Zoom screen. There should be a little spot that says Q&A. If you click on that, it'll let you enter your question. We'll answer the questions after the three presentations. We're also eager to get your feedback, so at the end of the webinar, we will provide a link to a short survey. Please take a minute to fill it out and let us know how you liked the webinar and what we can do to improve. With that, we can stop the screen sharing, go to our panelists. The Hoosier Environmental Council is a nonprofit organization founded in 1983 to work for a healthy environment and sustainable economy in Indiana. A big part of our job is tracking the environmentally related bills at the Indiana State House. With the 2024 legislative session set to begin in just a few weeks on January 8th, this webinar will review bills that may be introduced related to our state's water resources. With that, it's my privilege to introduce our first speaker. Representative Sharon Nagel has served in the Indiana House of Representatives since 2012, representing House District 13, with portions of Benton, Fountain, Jasper, Montgomery, Newton, Tippecanoe, Warren, and White counties. That sounds very busy. Representative Nagel also serves on the Wabash Economic Growth Alliance and the Midwest Passenger Rail Commission. She entered public service at the Indiana State House with considerable prior experience. She has a bachelor's in finance and economics from Western Michigan University and an MBA from the University of Houston. She has worked in corporate finance, city government, and for 27 years as a small business owner of Wolf's Homemade Candies. This is a very busy time of year for Wolf's Homemade Candies, so we sincerely appreciate your joining us here today. Representative Nagel, you've been working on an important issue of water withdrawals, and we're looking forward to your comments. Thank you for being here.
Very much appreciate it. As you can see in my background, I'm in my warehouse shipping right now. So taking a little break to talk to you about water. So let's start off with the issue that arose in my district. I wasn't really aware of it till earlier in the year that we had this testing going on and this potential access to our aquifer that is in Shadeland, which is Tippecanoe County area. And that's part of my district. It also happens to be a very agricultural area. So as we proceeded forward to understand what was going on, there is this interest in withdrawing a tremendous amount of water and piping it to the Lebanon area for the new LEAP district. And as we start to understand a little bit more of the science behind it, of course, most of us first think, well, why in the heck would you build something that needed so much water in that area? Why would you not build it close to the water? All kinds of questions like that have come up. But the reality is that we also know that, in our state, water is abundant in specific areas, and water is piped all over our state to provide water in areas that don't have water. What was so significantly different in this scenario is the volume of water. Their goal, the Indiana Economic Development Corporation, which has done great jobs throughout the state and growing and bringing companies in. This particular district, though, has become quite controversial because what they're really courting is a large chip manufacturer. And chip manufacturers require a lot of water, a lot of clean water. And the process that they're in trying to get that chip manufacturer is very competitive. It's through that federal grant, the CHIPS Act that was passed. And that, of course, is a very attractive thing for the state of Indiana since we are such a manufacturing-based state. So in essence, the first number we all heard is they wanted to transfer 100 million gallons a day from the aquifer, the alluvial aquifer underneath the Wabash River, 35 miles to Lebanon. And then to put it in perspective, we know that the city of Lafayette utilizes 17 million gallons a day. So that's quite a big difference and shocking number, actually. And then, there wasn't a tremendous amount of transparency and information put out there about what they were proposing. We do know, though, that it is still in its study phase, but there's a lot of people very concerned, and myself also, on this whole process. And what we discovered, and natural resources has never really been my strong suit. I'm more utilities and courts and criminal code. But I had to dive deep into understanding what are our current water laws. And what I discovered is we don't really have great water laws. And the reality is because we have such an abundance of water, there hasn't been this drive or push to set up regulation. Now, the regulation that does exist, I call it reactionary, meaning if a agricultural irrigator is using a tremendous amount of water and they significantly reduce the levels of wells in the area, then the DNR gets involved. We have code in which we immediately go in there under emergency rule to correct the issue. So that exists, but what doesn't exist is any kind of permitting prior to that. Basically, we're considered a primitive law state. We have what we call the absolute dominion laws, which basically says if you own the land, and you could take as much water as you want, the biggest straw that you have. And I can tell you frankly that many of us were shocked. We didn't really realize that that's what was going on. So myself and Senator Deary and I have been working since early summer on trying to come up with some proper regulatory process that, one, protects our citizens in that area, and also has a monitoring component to it. And you can imagine that there is a tremendous amount of pushback from various people, and that is something we're all used to as legislators. We work hard on trying to craft the right language and then work with stakeholders to try to figure out what's going to make best sense and what's workable. And from the beginning, we've always said we're not against economic development growth. We just want to make sure that our citizens in our area are protected for their future growth, and that our precious resources are managed properly. I mean, what some of the information that we're not getting, that they don't even really know yet, is what's the reuse of this water once it's piped into this area. And then, of course, what is the potential effect? And then specifically in that area in Shadeland, there is a lot of irrigators, and so a lot of agriculture there. And irrigation is quite significant there because it's very sandy soil. And some may say, well, maybe you shouldn't be even farming there, but the reality is for centuries people have been farming there. Families have made tremendous investments in their wells and their irrigators. And so we can't just look away at that. We have to really respect that investment's been made, and we have to make sure that they are protected. And then, that bigger picture when it comes to water is, I don't think most people realize that, what water we have on Earth is, we're not making any more water. That's it. That's the only water we have. It just gets distributed throughout our world. And overall, we as a country and as a state are going to have to be smart about this natural resource and make sure that we're doing the right things to prepare for the future, and that we're managing this resource in a way that is good for society as a whole. One of the things that I thought was real interesting in talking to a hydrologist that has been working on and doing the study on this water was he recommended to read a book called The Big Thirst. And I read it, and I thought it was the most eye-opening book about water resources, and recommend it to anybody who's really trying to dive deep into the subject matter. So we're hoping this coming session that we will have a hearing, and then we'll have the opportunity to discuss what Indiana needs to do when it comes to this regulatory process. We do know that we're in an uphill battle. I will have the bill in the House, and Senator Deary will have the bill in the Senate. We'll mirror each other. We've worked together to make sure that we can agree on the language, and then we both have collaborated on additional items. I think we're on our 10th revision at this point. So we feel like we're really close now. And we did have some high-level meetings at the State House on Organization Day. That high-level meeting, we finally got some agreement that if we could just set up some protocol and some reasonable guards against transferring this water. So guardrails was the proper word that was used. So that's kind of how we're defining it. This bill is setting up guardrails. We want, of course, we want this to be very transparent to the public. The transparency is certainly improved by now, but there has been, some damage to the public in the sense that the public has not been really well informed on this project. So I think they're trying hard to improve on that. So anyways, that's really about everything I have to say that I can at this point, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Representative Nagel. That's one thing you can certainly say about this LEAP project, is that it's brought increased appreciation for water and inspired this discussion of the state's water policy. Very much appreciate your sharing your comments and all of your work on the bill with Senator Deary. With that, I'll introduce our second speaker. William Bloomquist, or Bill, as we all know him affectionately, is a staff member at the White River Alliance, Professor Emeritus of Political Science at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis, Senior Research Fellow of the Ostrom Workshop at Indiana University, and an adjunct instructor at Butler University. At IUPUI, he also served as Dean of the IU School of Liberal Arts and as chair of the Political Science Department. His research interests concern government organizations and public policy, with a specialization in the field of water institutions and water management. He's the author, co-author, or co-editor of more than 80 articles, chapters, published reports, and books. Bill, I'm getting tired just reading about all this work.
I'm getting tired of listening to it. You should give a much shorter introduction next time. Thank you.
He received his PhD in political science from IU Bloomington and a master's and bachelor's from Ohio University. Bill, welcome, and thank you for being with us here today.
Thank you, Indra. I'm honored to be here. Great to be here with Representative Nagel too. And I just want to echo or second the endorsement of the book, The Big Thirst. It's a delightful read. It's what happens when journalists instead of academics write about water, which is that it's actually interesting. And a fun read. And so for anybody who's new to the topic, it's a great read. All right, I, however, was asked to come and talk about the Drainage Task Force, which is a precursor, maybe a precursor to some things that might be introduced at the 2024 legislative session. And Indra and I spent quite a bit of time attending Drainage Task Force meetings. I'm just going to give those of you who aren't familiar with the task force a little overview, and then share with you what the task force did over the course of its time, and then a couple of thoughts about what might come out of that. So as you can see here, it was a task force that was composed of both legislators and non-legislator members. It was co-chaired by Senator Leising and Representative Baird. There were 10 other legislators on the task force. You can see their names here, 5 from the Senate, 5 from the House, and then 7 non-legislative members. 2 of them were state agency office directors. A couple of them are elected local officials, and some private citizens. And they first met in November 2021. So the legislation authorizing the task force was in the 21 session. and they met through October 2023. 5 meetings altogether, 5 hearings altogether. And I put this slide together. This is not the way you would perhaps necessarily talk about a task force and what it did, but I wanted to give you a little breakout of the topics that they spent time on. Because this was a task force that had the authority under its legislation to cover floodplain and wetlands issues. It turned out that they spent a lot of time on floodplain and wetlands issues. And so as you can see here, just a sort of a quick count, the presentations to the task force, the floodplain and wetlands presentations combined certainly outnumbered the presentations about our drainage laws and their administration. Public comments to the task force also, wetlands and floodplains outweighed the number of public comments about drainage law and administration. Next slide, please. And so in particular, more meeting time and discussion. So when I think about not just the presentations that were made to the task force or the public comments that were offered to the task force, but also the amount of time the task force members themselves spent asking questions and discussing issues. By far more meeting time and discussion were devoted to the floodplain maps than any other issue. And so here I'm just going to pause long enough. If you're not already familiar with this floodplain map issue, very briefly, Indiana developed new floodplain maps that cover more of the state and use more recent data than the older maps that were developed by the federal government, by FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. So you may be familiar with FEMA maps, or if you're in a FEMA floodplain, but there are these newer maps that the Department of Natural Resources of Indiana developed, as I said, covering more of the state and using more recent data. Consequence of that was that when you cover more of the state with floodplain mapping, you find more floodplains. Other consequence of that is when you use more recent data, you find more floodplain area because of increasing precipitation and runoff and increasing frequency of flooding in our state. So more recent data and a larger amount of the state covered meant that the newer floodplain maps pulled more property into, or identified more property as being within floodplains. People don't like being in floodplains. They don't like being told that they're in floodplains, whether they are or not. And so the new floodplain maps raised a significant amount of criticism and constituent complaints to their representatives in the General Assembly, and even resulted in a piece of legislation enacted during 2023 called Senate Enrolled Act 242 that told local floodplain administrators they did not have to use the newer maps, and that they could either use FEMA maps or maps provided by a property owner to determine whether a property was in a floodplain for purposes of issuing permits for construction. The floodplain map issue, I'm still on the previous slide, so if you would, just for a moment. So just a further indication of how the floodplain map issue kind of took over the drainage task force in terms of the largest amount of time and discussion. Task force members at the end of a task force, those of you not familiar with this process, at the end of a task force, members are usually of the task force are invited to submit recommendations that might go into the task force final report and constitute recommendations from the task force if they get support from the other task force members. 10 of the 30 recommendations the task force, this is the drainage task force, but 10 of the 30 recommendations submitted by task force members dealt with the floodplains and floodplain maps. Um, and now I think I can move forward to the next slide. Thank you. So it wasn't the only thing they talked about. So there were recommendations submitted by task force members about drainage law and administration. We have in Indiana a drainage code element of our Indiana code, and there is a drainage handbook which provides advice on how to manage drainage, both the infrastructure of drainage and the surrounding lands. These are now somewhat dated, and task force members recommended updating the drainage handbook and or provisions of the drainage code. And then 5 of the 30 recommendations submitted by task force members dealt with wetlands, and Indra's going to talk about the wetlands issue next, so I won't spend time over that. But several of those 5 recommendations, some endorsed protecting remaining wetlands in the state, or referred to the 2022 final report of the Wetlands Task Force. Here was another area where the Drainage Task Force sort of overlapped with a Wetlands Task Force that had just concluded its work the prior year. So now if I may go on to the next slide, and I think this is my last slide as well. So in October, 2 months ago, as the Drainage Task Force was winding down its work because it was under a statutory deadline to conclude its work, the 30 recommendations that the task force members generated became the subject then of discussion and voting. And the final meeting of the task force resulted in a number of recommendations that were probably, and I don't mean to put words in their mouth, but I think from their comments you could have inferred, probably supported by the co-chairs of the task force. Some of those recommendations didn't pass. Some recommendations that the co-chairs probably did not support did pass. And there was some consternation about what passed and what didn't pass. And in the end, the draft final report and the recommendations were all voted down, meaning that even individual recommendations that had passed with a majority of the task force members voting wouldn't make it into the final report. In fact, the task force decided to adjourn without issuing a final report, which was for all of the task force members, and certainly for the citizens who had attended the meetings and people who made public comments and so forth, a pretty disappointing result, as you can imagine. But the last bullet point on this slide is important. Just because 30 recommendations of the task force members didn't end up in the task force final report, don't come forward to the General Assembly as recommendations from the task force itself. There were, as I mentioned at the beginning, there were 12 legislators on the task force, all of whom will be in the General Assembly for the 2024 session. And any of the 12 legislators on the task force could introduce bills based on recommendations that the task force considered. I'm not trying to be confusing here, so let me just back over that for a second. The task force as a task force didn't produce a final report and recommendations. But the 12 legislators who served on the task force are of course free to introduce their own bills. Representative Nagel and Senator Deary are going to introduce a bill on water withdrawals, and do we need to have a permitting system, for example. Any of the 12 legislators on the Drainage Task Force can introduce bills in the 2024 session. So it is possible that even though some of the recommendations that were debated at the task force didn't make it into a task force final report, some of those recommendations could still surface as bills introduced in the 2024 or subsequent legislative session. I think I think that's probably enough from me on that, and we'll hand it off to Indra to talk about wetlands, and then we'll have some questions afterwards.
Thanks so much, Bill. Really appreciate it. And you were going over a fairly complex area. If I could ask a question of my own just before I start on the wetlands, out of the various topics that the task force took on, did you get a sense of which are most likely to show up as bills during the 2024 session?
If I had to wager, the two would be about the floodplain maps again. I think one would be a recommendation that any future changes to floodplain maps be noticed in a more explicit and clear way to property owners who are potentially affected. It seemed as though there was a fairly broad consensus, even among a task force that in the end sort of dissolved into dissension. There was a fairly high level of consensus that the new floodplain maps had not been communicated as effectively as they could have been to property owners in the state. I think there probably is still some I dotting and T crossing that legislators will want to do about that. And then the other thing that I would imagine you'd see a bill introduced about, which would be this idea of ground truthing the maps. And that's something that I think got a lot of head nodding among the task force members. It sounds like it's one of those ideas that people go, oh, well, sure, you should check and make sure they're accurate. It's a daunting challenge, to say the least. It's hard to imagine how many DNR personnel you would need to comb the landscape of the state of Indiana, to check all of those floodplain elevations manually. It might be introduced because it sounds good. It would be a bear to try to implement. I guess I'll leave it at that. So it might be introduced simply because I think it would probably make some disgruntled constituents happy to see something like that introduced.
Yeah. No, I agree. Well, thank you so much for comments and reviewing the complexities that came from the drainage task force. With that, let's go back to our slide deck. And we'll move from floodplains and drainage to the complementary topic, which is wetlands. Let's go to our next slide. First off, I just wanted to pause for a minute and ask the question, why are we talking about wetland policy? Why should there be wetland laws and regulations? For instance, if I own private property and I have wetlands, why can't I do what I want to do with those wetlands? Those are some of the questions that come up when we start talking about wetland policy. Part of the answer is the quote here on this slide. Indiana is at a point where the cumulative loss of wetlands is having a measurable negative impact. And that's a quote from the Indiana Wetland Task Force and their report that was issued just over a year ago. Another part of the answer is that wetlands are a critical component of our water resources, and water is a shared resource. It ignores property lines. As Representative Nagel pointed out, if one person is using a lot of water through their well, it could affect the neighbor's well. That's just one of the ways that it crosses property lines. So let's go to the next slide. The Wetland Task Force pointed out that we're seeing negative impacts from the loss of wetlands. That's because wetlands have important functions within our water system. Wetlands purify water. They reduce flooding because they store water. They're like giant sponges on the landscape that can soak up excess water. The EPA reports that 1 acre of wetland can store up to 1.5 million gallons of water. And because they're storing that water, it slows the water down, so that reduces erosion. While they're storing the water, it's soaking in, and that replenishes the groundwater we rely on for our wells. Wetlands are also critical habitat for fish and wildlife. They're among the most biologically productive ecosystems. About half of the threatened or endangered species in Indiana rely on wetlands. So when we lose wetlands, we're also at risk of continuing to lose species. Some of the useful functions of wetlands some of the useful functions they provide for us have been translated into dollar figures. The numbers on this slide are from the Indiana Department of of Natural Resources, which estimates that 1 acre of wetlands annually provides $248 in purification services, $2,270 in storage, which means reduced flooding, and $1,055 in erosion prevention. But these numbers relate just to a single acre. Indiana has around 800,000 acres of wetlands left, so the total economic benefit of our wetlands is counted in the billions of dollars per year. Let's go to the next slide. This graphic helps to illustrate the point about storage of water in wetlands. In this little landscape, we see 4 intact wetlands that are busy storing, 1 to 1.5 million gallons of water per acre. If we go to the next slide, if those 4 wetlands have been destroyed and drained, the water that they used to store has to go somewhere else, and it could flood the neighbor. It's one of the nicest illustrations I've seen that just visually captures that notion of how wetlands are part of a shared water resource. Let's go to the next slide. Unfortunately, at least 85% of Indiana's wetlands have already been lost. Prior to European settlement, 24% of Indiana's acreage was wetland. And of course, along the way, that was drained and filled to make room for our farms, towns, and roads. But we've now reached a point where, as our Wetland Task Force pointed out, we've lost so many that it's starting to have a negative impact. Let's go to the next slide. At the same time, we need our wetlands more than ever. Our state is water rich, as Representative Nagel pointed out, but we are getting even wetter. There's been an increase in annual average precipitation since the 1890s in all parts of the state. And of course, that's the average annual precipitation. I realize that for the recent few months, we've had a dry spell. But if we look year on year, since the 1890s, we've had an increase. Overall, it's about 6 inches of additional precipitation per year over the state. And the wetlands play a role in dealing with that extra precipitation. Wetlands are the most cost-effective stormwater infrastructure there is. When we lose wetlands, our local governments have to build additional infrastructure to handle the extra stormwater. Let's go to the next slide. Next, we'll talk about the policy context, meaning what is the state of our wetland laws and regulations today? Indiana has had a wetland law and required wetland permits since the early 2000s. In 2021, protection of wetlands was reduced by a bill that passed the State House, Senate Enrolled Act 389, which added exemptions to the state wetlands law. That bill, 389, took effect in the summer of 2021. So this summer, there were 2 years of permit data to show what the effect was on the law. The data show that since 389 passed, with all of its additional exemptions, only 25% of the wetland acres that are being destroyed are being mitigated. That means 75% of the wetland acres being destroyed are simply lost, and there's no mitigation of their lost function. This year, federal wetland protection was reduced by the U.S. Supreme Court's Sackett decision. The Sackett decision means that very few Indiana wetlands have federal protection under the Clean Water Act. Prior to the Sackett decision, about 80% of Indiana's wetlands had federal protection. After the decision, it's less than 20%. So we went from 80% federal protection to 20% federal protection or less. So we could kind of summarize it by saying that the Supreme Court essentially said that the fate of the remaining wetlands is in the hands of the states. Between 2021 and that reduction in state protection and this year's reduction in federal protection, we're now entering an era of accelerated wetland loss. That makes timely action by the Indiana General Assembly very meaningful as we go into the 2024 session. Next slide, please. And in fact, we know of 4 possible wetland-related bills. They haven't been introduced yet, so at this point, we're still talking about possibilities. They fall into 2 categories: a bill to create voluntary incentives and 3 bills about wetland regulation. The bills about regulation can be summarized as change the law, repeal the law, or create a new law. So let's look at those possible bills. Next slide. The voluntary incentive bill would create a property tax reduction for preserving wetlands. If this were to pass, a property owner who preserved wetlands on their property could have lower property taxes. It would be an incentive for wetland preservation, and it would be a way for society to reward the owner for doing something that benefits the broader society. Another aspect of this bill that I think is beneficial, assuming that it gets introduced, is that it builds on an existing program that we already have in the state. It simply opens up that existing program to more wetlands. That should make it easier to implement. Next slide. So changing the law. We have heard that there could be a bill or bills making changes to the existing state wetlands law, changing the way either that wetlands are classified or restoring the simpler general permits that were removed in 2021. We'll want to keep a close eye on any bill about changing wetland classes, because under our current wetland law, how the wetlands are classified determines whether they're protected under that law. Let's go to the next slide. It's possible that there could be a bill to repeal Indiana's wetlands law and entirely remove state protection from wetlands. And I say this because back in 2021, Senate Enrolled Act 389 was actually initially introduced as a bill to completely repeal the wetlands law. And we have heard talk that there could be another attempt at that full repeal. During the 2021 legislative process, that bill was altered to keep the law, but to add significant new exemptions to it that reduced the number of wetlands that were protected. A new bill to repeal the state wetlands law would be controversial. So there's some hope in that, because the House and Senate leadership have already said that they want to avoid controversial issues during the 2024 session. We know that such a bill would be controversial in part because there was bipartisan opposition to the 2021 bill in both the House and the Senate, and there were more than 100 organizations that signed a letter asking the governor to veto that bill in 2021. And so we have a sense that if there is another attempt at a repeal, it will be controversial. Let's go to the next slide. The last possibility I'm going to discuss is a bill that would replace Indiana's existing law with a new wetland law. The current Indiana wetland law was written in the early 2000s, and it includes a unique system of classifying wetlands. Ohio has something similar, but otherwise no other state classifies wetlands the same way Indiana does. And unfortunately, those Indiana wetland classes create problems. We've had more than 20 years with that law, so we've had a chance to kind of beta test it and see where those problems lie. There's a certain amount of subjectivity involved in determining which class a wetland belongs in, and there aren't good dividing lines between the classes. This has led to complaints from the construction industry that Indiana's wetland permitting process is slow, complex, and inconsistent. Next slide. And that should just, yeah, there we go. So the new proposal would remove the classes in order to create wetland permitting that is faster, easier, and more consistent. Next slide. It would restore some of the wetland protection lost in 2021. It would create a new Indiana wetland law that more closely mirrors the federal wetland permit process used by the Army Corps of Engineers. That way, if whether a wetland is federal or state under state jurisdiction, basically the process would be the same. So the permittee applying for the permit wouldn't have to worry so much about whether it was a federal or a state permit. And then next slide. This concept was first proposed as an alternative in 2021 during the debate over that bill, but this concept didn't get traction at that time. This summer, the concept was fully written out in detail by wetland scientists with many years' experience and with help from the Conservation Law Center. We don't know for certain whether it will be introduced as a bill in 2024, but we have reason to be hopeful. I've talked about the importance of wetlands so far, how they reduce flooding, reduce erosion, purify water, recharge groundwater, and provide critical wildlife habitat. And I've gone over the policy context, the fact that we're currently at a place where we've lost state protection and we've lost federal protection. And then I finished by reviewing 4 possible wetland bills that could arise during the 2024 session. Let's go to the next slide. Yeah. The Hoosier Environmental Council provides legislative updates online. If you're interested in the environmental bills that come up during the session and what happens to them, you can find those updates on our website, on our Bill Watch page. Bill Watch 2024 is not online yet, but it will be soon. Next slide. We also provide legislative updates in our email newsletter, our e-news. The e-news goes out weekly during the legislative session. You can sign up for it on our website. If you sign up, please rest assured that we never sell or share your contact information with other organizations or businesses. And of course, we also post regularly on social media. Next slide. I'd like to encourage everyone who's attending today to contact your legislators and tell them about issues that are important to you, whether it's the issues that we're talking about here regarding water, or there are other issues. Our legislators represent us at the State House, and it's important for them to hear from constituents. You can meet with them in person by requesting a meeting with their assistant, attend their town hall meetings, or send messages by email or phone. With that, let's stop the slide sharing. We're going to go to your questions. The questions, if you haven't typed them in yet, you can put them into the section called Q&A, and there's a little icon at the bottom of your screen called Q&A where you can type them in. Representative Nagel, can you turn your camera back on for this portion of the webinar? Thank you.
Yep.
And actually, our first question is for you. It asks if there are bill numbers yet for your bill and Senator Deary's bill.
So we are still in the draft mode. So right now we have preliminary draft numbers, which really will not mean anything. The bill number will get assigned it just takes a little bit of time. So we should have a bill number, I would hope, early January.
Very good. And I'm confident that that one will appear on our Bill Watch page, and probably Bill Watch pages for many other organizations.
Yes, I'm confident of that too.
Yeah, no, there's been a lot of interest in that issue. And actually, along those lines, we have someone who asked the question whether you're working with the DNR as you work on that bill. And of course, if there are other organizations that have been important as you're working on it.
So the governing body that we're going to utilize, it is all in Title 14, but the governing body we're going to use is the Natural Resource Commission for the permitting process. And in our high-level meetings, it's really more with the Indiana Finance Authority, the IEDC, the utility companies. So you're talking Indiana Water and Citizens, legislators that are in high positions. So your speaker, your president pro tem over at the Senate, and then also both of our utility chairs. And we've been pretty much told this is not going to go to natural resources, it's going to go to utilities. So, which is unique to me because it's all in Title 14, but that's what we're hearing right now. And that's primarily who we are dealing with. I understand the Department of Natural Resources has not really been that much involved, and there's probably some political reasons why. But at this point, it's out there. Everyone knows what we're working on, and the Department of Natural Resources knows also.
Fantastic. Thank you. Question for Bill. The draft recommendations issued by the Drainage Task Force, are they available in any public form?
Yes, you can find them. So it just takes a couple of clicks, but if you go to the Indiana General Assembly website, it's not entirely intuitive, so I'm just going to step you through it. It's first of all, it's an easy website to find. It's iga.in.gov. Once you go there, you see tabs across the top of the screen, one of which will say committees. If you click on committees, you get a drop-down menu, and you have to go all the way to the bottom where it says all committees, because a task force isn't a House committee or a Senate committee or a standing committee or a select committee. So you have to go to the default all committees option and then find interim committees. These are committees that meet between legislative sessions, and that's where you'll find task forces. Scroll down until you find the Drainage Task Force. You can click on that. If you go to it's the agenda for their 5th meeting, I believe. You'll see the recommendations that were submitted by the task force members for consideration. So I'm sorry for the steps, but yeah, it's you can find it. It just takes a little clicking through the General Assembly website, and interim committees and task forces tend to get kind of tucked away at the bottom there. So you just have to go scratching for the Drainage Task Force.
Yeah. Another one for you, Bill, if you don't mind. And I know you touched on this, but could you go over again why the Drainage Task Force didn't have a final report?
Yeah, I'll do my best with this, because Indra was there for that 5th and final meeting too, and I think we can both share that it got a little disorganized towards the end. But there were 2 reasons. One, they had split votes on most of the recommendations that they took up. It was, things were coming through with 9 to 8 for, or 9 to 8 against, and some abstaining, and so forth and so on. So you were in a place where there wasn't a high level of consensus among the task force members on the recommendations. So that was one aspect of it, but that you could work through, right? If you're having difficulty reaching agreement, if you're having difficulty sort of sorting through the recommendations, maybe it's a wording issue or something like that, you could sort through. So this is where the second reason really comes into play, which is they were out of time. A legislatively created task force like the Drainage Task Force, Representative Nagel can correct me if I get some of this wrong, because she's been through a number of these in her decade plus, but they're given basically a schedule for their existence. And the Drainage Task Force was given a schedule where they could have 5 meetings, and they had to be done by the end of October 2023. So they had to go out of it. They had to get a final report done, or basically go out of existence. And that 5th meeting was October 25th, 2023. So A, it was their 5th meeting, and they were authorized to meet 5 times, and B, it was 6 days before they were going to go out of business anyway. So whatever the issues were that they were having difficulty resolving and coming to majority or consensus views about, happened at a point where they just didn't have any time left. And at that point, they just decided to adjourn without issuing a final report, in part because they didn't have any meeting time left.
In a sense, it was almost the right thing to have happen, given that they weren't finding consensus within the task force. They really took on very complex issues and a fair number of issues, as you pointed out.
Yeah, I agree with you about that, Indra. And it sounds like And it was frustrating to them. I mean, Senator Leising was quoted in the news the next day or later that week about how it was the most frustrating thing and Senator Leising been in the General Assembly a long time, and she said it was the most frustrating or disappointing, I forget which adjective she used, experience she'd had. So I mean, members were not happy about having to disband without issuing a final report, but they literally ran out of time.
Yeah. Representative Nagel, your bill and your work with Senator Deary really look at Indiana's water supply. And as you pointed out, the fact that in the past, we've been able to take water for granted. Could you comment on maybe how policy might be playing more of a role going forward?
Sure. So we know by looking at where our population growths are, that central Indiana by 2050 is going to have a shortfall of water. So we are going to have to start planning ahead on how we're going to deal with that. But again, I go back to after reading The Big Thirst and really start thinking about how well are we managing our reuse of water? You know, how are we managing our efficiencies and use? I mean, the problem is that when water is abundant and we're paying a very low price, we tend to be less conscious of our use. And so I think going forward as policy, we're going to have to look at all of those factors and educating the population on water use and how we can do a better job. I thought so interesting in areas on new builds where the water that is not, of course, drinking water that you're using, forgot what the term is affluent water that you can't drink, but you can use it to water your grass. Now they have a purple water line coming in that's specifically for those type of things. I mean, new construction is going to need to be really thought out on how well we manage our reuse of water. A good example is in Vegas. I mean, all their fountains, and they really had to completely rethink how they manage their water out there. And again, you know, you don't get to use drinking water for a fountain. So that's the kind of stuff that policy is going to have to dive in deeper. The pressure's not been on Indiana for good reason. It's just because of our abundancy. Pressure has been on, though, the Western states, and it's good to look to see what they're doing.
One last question, also looking at LEAP, is there also going to be policy discussion about the discharge of that water once it's been moved from one watershed to another watershed?
Well, there has been conversations about it, but we're basically being told that, you know, that's kind of out in the distance, that's not really been thought through yet. They're just doing this preliminary study to see if the water's available and they can move it there. But that's definitely coming up on conversation. Well, we need to understand what you're going to do with this water, you know, after it's being used, and what is the reuse, and also what if we don't get the chip manufacturer? And I mean, there's just a lot of what ifs.
All right, we have a question that I think maybe all three of us can touch on. What is the best way for water scientists to be involved in these policy discussions? I think it's a marvelous question. Of course, the legislative process is a public process that has committee hearings, and you know, anyone with an interest in a bill can sign up to speak at a committee hearing. So I'll toss that in as my answer. But Bill, what do you think? What's the best way for water scientists to get involved?
I would encourage folks to look for organizations that they're comfortable joining. Because and this is just an extension of what you were saying, Indra, it is a public process. Not everything happens as transparently as we would like, as Representative Nagel pointed out. But it is a public process, and water scientists, whether they want to, can find an organization that they feel comfortable getting involved in. And that's a great way to follow the process and engage with the process without necessarily feeling like you have to take it onto your own shoulders to learn everything, to know who's who, to know which committee does what, and so forth and so on. So I would encourage water scientists to look across the landscape of organizations, whether it's Hoosier Environmental Council or the White River Alliance that I'm involved in, or whoever, and find somebody, the Farm Bureau, find somebody who speaks to or whose mission seems to be compatible with your interests, and get involved.
Good point. Representative Nagel, what do you think? How should water scientists get involved?
So your answer was, great. I mean, obviously coming to committees and testifying, and, being conscious of when these bills are being heard, and it'd be, it's always helpful to have experts there. But also in our summer studies, I mean, it's super helpful to have the experts when we're studying a subject matter. And reach out to your state representative. I mean, I think, half of the battle is educating all of us on a subject matter that frankly, I own a candy company. I don't know a lot about water. I've learned a lot, and that's what legislators do. We learn a lot about subject matters that we have never delved into before. So having being able to reach out and touch and talk to a scientist is incredibly helpful.
Exactly. Yeah, as our elected officials, you have to draw on the expertise of the population and then distill that into what needs to happen in law. So yeah, appreciate all that you do. We will have to close there. The questions have been excellent. Thank you so much. And I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all of them, but the questions that we have not had a chance to answer live on the webinar, we will be putting into a blog post within the next few days, and we will answer those questions to the best of our ability. I would like to thank and express gratitude again to our speakers, Representative Sharon Nagel and Dr. Bill Bloomquist. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. We have two quick closing slides, just expressing again our gratitude to our green business sponsors, Logistic, Innovative Solar, and Singer Wealth Advisory of Raymond James. And finally, for our audience, thank you so much for being with us today. We value your feedback. Please take a moment to fill out a short survey, letting us know how the webinar went and what we could do better in the future. The survey is at the link in the chat or available through this QR code.